This, this is the worst. This espresso.
Take it easy.
Hi, hello, and welcome to Coffee Literature Review. My name's Chris Hendon, and I'm today joined by Doran Pennington, my producer. And today we're going to be discussing a paper published in Nature Plants in 2021. The title is Arabica-like Flavor in a Heat-Tolerant Wild Coffee Species. This article is out of the lab of Aaron Davis, who operates out of Kew Gardens in London. It's an interesting paper because the idea or the premise is that they are exploring the flavor profile of coffee Stenophylla. The species of coffee was first reported in the 1800s, but then seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth, and then was then recently rediscovered in Sierra Leone. Davis and colleagues go on through this paper to show that the rediscovered variety of coffee has desirable flavor characteristics rivaling that of specialty Arabica coffees and is more heat tolerant, and in principle serves as a future-proofing and tasty alternative to Arabica.
There's been no published sensory information since the 1920s. So no one has talked about what this tastes like in 100 years.
It's my pleasure today to also be joined by Carly Green. Carly has had a long and decorated career in the coffee industry, initially working with Blue Bottle Coffee as their green coffee specialist and lab manager, and then more recently is now transplanted from America over to the Netherlands, where you're now currently running Carly Green Coffee Consulting.
Yes. Yeah. Happy to be here. I've been consulting now for about a year, a little over a year, but I've actually started a new business that I'm launching on Thursday. Can I
Tell
talk
us about
it?
We talk about it. We would love that. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, so since I've moved to the Netherlands, I've been getting to know a lot of great roasters in Europe, and in my background in coffee is mostly in cupping and quality control, and I've just met a lot of people who wanted to learn more about cupping, get stronger in their comfort level for cupping, and so I created a monthly subscription called Cherry Love Coffee.
Cherry Love?
Yeah, it's a monthly subscription, and you get 4 coffees from some of my favorite roasters in Europe, and they're blind, so they're labeled A through D. And then it comes with an activity book with new games every month that guide you through the tasting experience. And then after you get through your book, you reveal the coffee in a top secret little envelope. And so it's great for palate development or just a fun way to experience your coffees at home. And I'm launching it publicly in 2 days. So I guess by the time this podcast is out, it'll be out in the world.
First of all, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I've been involved in coffee a little bit for some time now. And of course, we try and do as much blind tasting as possible because I really truly believe that develops the palate, but also makes you leave your biases behind.
Exactly.
And in the lab, we have coffees all the time, and we try and do this together. And for you to have a company that now does this in an educational way, but also fun, is really exciting. You're definitely going to have subscribers from our laboratory. We're looking forward to it. And also because we don't interact with European coffee that much, so that's going to be a European roasted coffee that much, that is. So that's going to be a nice addition to our lab. So I would like to be customer number 001. So we'll see how we go. We'll see how we go with that. Let me take a step back for a second. So that's brown coffee, right? You're sending it to people roasted. Carly Green.
I know I'm abandoning my name, namesake.
Are you including any non-Arabica coffees in your subscription?
I want to, but do you think they're gonna be mad? I'm gonna blame you if they get mad.
Okay, that's fine. You can blame us. Doran, that was a professional transition. So I guess we should transition to talking about the paper that we've all just hopefully read and thought about. This article was published in Nature Plants in 2021. This is from a very well published, highly respected researcher, Aaron Davis, who's out of Kew Gardens, which is somewhat of you can think of it as like a greenhouse that is located in a public space in London that also does academic research. So it's quite unusual. It's not fitting into the typical mold of the university style of research, but they published really important papers largely related to how climate change is impacting coffee quality. So there's been a series of papers from this guy over the years, including some showing that Ethiopia is getting hotter in the Harar region and drier, and as a result, it's going to mean that it's going to be difficult to rely on high quality Ethiopian coffees from that region. And some of the climate models that he published in some other papers suggested that it's as dire as we have to figure this out in 50 years, otherwise we won't have coffee from that region. And so what this paper's title then is Arabica-like flavor in a heat-tolerant wild coffee species. Specifically, we're talking about Stenophylla, which is one of the sort of more rare, I guess, Arabica-like coffee plants that some of us have heard about, very few have tasted. And it's, I think, native to Guinea, Sierra Leone, and the Ivory Coast. So we're talking sort of on the shoulder there of Western Africa, not typically where we as specialty coffee drinkers, enthusiasts, and green buyers would typically be looking for high quality Arabica crops. So first of all, Carly, let me ask you, did or have you in your career ever purchased a coffee from Guinea, Sierra Leone, or the Ivory Coast?
Not to my knowledge. No,
It's an interesting place, right?
Didn't they say in the paper that Arabica can't even be grown in these regions?
They go on to show a little plot of, a picture of Africa in the paper here, and they show that Stenophylla is located very, very locally on that sort of western portion of Africa. You can find Canephora over there and Liberica over there as well, but you definitely are not finding Arabica in that producing region. In part because I think it's growing, it's much hotter there. Number one, they do plot the mean temperature versus the annual precipitation. Okay, and given that this coffee Stenophylla only grows in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Ivory Coast, that these points that are on this plot, and in particular two of them, map directly to the the plot of Earth. And you can see there that the precipitation actually spans quite a large range from elevated well above that of Arabica to down sort of to the lower level of rain that most Arabica gets. All this is to say, it seems like this plant can tolerate a lot of water or also not a lot of water. The other thing is pretty clear is that Arabica likes to grow at the annual mean temperature between roughly 16 and roughly 22 degrees Celsius. And Stenophylla likes to grow at 24 Celsius and above average mean temperature. On Earth, a 2-degree difference in average mean temperature is massive. This is the difference between living somewhere hot and living somewhere not hot.
Yeah, that plot I find really compelling because you see that at least for rainfall that this can tolerate basically anything.
Right.
But then the temperature question is interesting because you could see this as kind of expanding the bean belt or something, or letting you grow coffee.
Changing it, right?
Yeah.
Adjusting it like almost significantly. I mean, yeah, overall, it's super interesting. It seems like the species has a lot of potential, mostly due to its heat resilience. And I mean, the fact that it can thrive like 6.8 degrees Celsius higher than Arabica, is that the number? That's huge. Isn't that like 44 degrees Fahrenheit? I mean, yeah, it's wild.
Mm-hmm. I found an article on Sprudge where they talk about developing a farm where they're growing specifically Stenophylla to really do a bigger scale analysis of it. And they say that the first harvest will begin in about 2025. So there's still quite a ways to go, but it's a big question, right? Like whenever you can actually farm this coffee instead of just finding it in the wild and picking some beans off and putting them in an SCA cupping, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
what actually comes
There's
out?
some really big questions about it still. And it sounds like the yields are lower on average than the other species. And we don't know if it's drought resistant yet. So I'm curious what they're going to do. Yeah, to study for it. That's so interesting that they're starting that.
We're looking at a crop that's supposed to, in principle, be a substitute, a high quality substitute for coffee Arabica. And the critical thing here is that this Stenophylla needs to taste good. And they have this spider chart. They call it a radar graph, where there's basically 8 different properties that go around the wheel, ranging from fruity to acidity, bitterness, astringency, and so forth. And they arrive at this simple looking chart through doing some sensory analysis. Carly, I want to throw it to you and say, talk us through how they did the sensory analysis of coffee Stenophylla and how they were able to then make comparisons to Arabica and Robusta and all the other things that are in this paper.
Yeah, so I found this super interesting. I have a lot of questions for them about the choices they made in doing the sensory analysis, but generally walking away, I did find it a little bit contradicting and unclear, though to be fair, they had a lot of limitations with the sample they were dealing with, right? Like it's a really small sample size. The processing on it was not the best. They even referred to it as crude processing, which sounds kind of brutal.
Yeah,
They
what do you
even
think that
said,
means? What's crude
I don't
processing?
know. I'm like, gosh, I want more information about the processing, but I guess crude is all we're gonna get.
Uh-huh.
I think it's probably enough to gather that it's maybe not the best, but they said later in the paper that the two samples they had gathered were completely different in their caffeine content, which I found so interesting because that wasn't mentioned much in how they facilitated the sensory analysis and maybe separating the two levels of caffeine, because we know caffeine tends to impact flavor quite significantly. If you look at the difference between Arabica and Robusta, and the fact that Robusta has about twice the amount of caffeine, it really adds to the bitterness. So I didn't see much of that mentioned in the sensory analysis, which I find kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, so to that point, when you think of caffeine in Robusta versus Arabica, what do you think that contributes to the flavor profile? As I'm usually taught, that's bitterness, right?
Definitely. Yeah, I'd say it's pretty straightforward in its
Yeah.
flavor. Yeah.
So in one of their charts, they go on to show that that this Robusta from Indonesia has seemingly twice as intense bitterness as that of the
Mhm.
Arabica samples from Ethiopia, and also
Mhm.
twice as intense the bitterness as that compared to the Stenophylla that we're talking about now. So
Right.
so that's good because at least it aligns with our intuition, which is that Robusta has twice as much caffeine in it. It also happens to be twice as bitter in the at least this sort of distilled version of the sensory experiment. Tell me about this sensory experiment. So what did they do? You say you have questions. Tell me about what questions you've
I have
got.
some questions. Yeah. So, I mean, for the way they facilitated the analysis, so they didn't have much to work with. So my first question is, why did they choose to split the sample into two forms of sensory analysis? So I'm curious, and as a researcher, I'm curious from your perspective, why they did not, gather more data points with the same type of scoring sheet. They split it into two. So they used the CIRAD form, which I'm not familiar with. I actually tried to find it online and read more about it, and that's the spider graph that you're referring to. And
Mhm.
there was a paywall, so I'm so sorry, but that's where my curiosity is.
So I can actually tell you.
Oh,
So
really? Yeah.
yeah, I can tell you about the processing and about the cupping. So there in papers are things called supplementary information files, which are kind of accompaniments to the paper that don't really fit into the main text.
Mhm.
So if you look in the SI, the crude processing that they're talking about, and the reason that they do two different cuppings is because they have two different samples that are taken from two different places.
Those are the
And
two levels of caffeine then,
so one
right?
of the
That's right. Yeah.
one of the
Okay.
samples they had quite a lot of. It yielded 740 grams of green coffee, and that's the one
Okay.
where they do the Syrah cupping with the different roast levels and things like that. So they do a light, medium, and a dark roast. In the paper, they only show the results for the light roast.
They
I
also, just to add to that, they also process that coffee via the washed method. So they used a wet
Okay.
milled process. So
Mhm.
it's
Okay.
they do talk about it also undergoing a so-called dry fermentation, which had mucilage attached for 24 hours. But they it's you can think of it like almost like pseudo honey processed.
Mm.
But it's
So is it
because
washed or is it honey?
so they use water to remove as much fruit as possible, and then they leave
Or the
some of the fruity
semi-washed?
mucilage, whatever's left on it, just on it
Mhm.
for 24 hours.
I
Yeah,
see.
so
Okay.
that is all the stuff that they do the Syrah cupping on. The one that they do the SCA cupping on is only 10 grams of coffee.
Oh, wow.
And the way
Yeah.
that they did that is a small sample, about 70 grams of cherry, was harvested and depulped by hand, dried indoors for 2 days, sun dried for 4 days, and rested for 4 months at room temperature prior to roasting.
Mm.
And then after that, they got 10 grams of coffee, which they cupped according to the SCA protocol.
So with the SCA scoring, it was interesting because they had 3 cuppers score this coffee. And then they had the lead panelists determine the final score for it, which they said was a consensus. But a consensus isn't an average of scores. So it kind of seems like there might be only one real score to go off of here, which is, I thought, like,
Yeah, which is just specialty, 80.25.
yeah, just barely, right? Yeah. Well, I kind of want to take it back a second because the way that might be a nice way to pull this apart a little bit is to talk about like the positive sensory findings here and then the negative ones and how they kind of play together to paint a picture of what this coffee tastes like, right? So for the positive sensory findings here, the panelists that used the CIRAD form found natural sweetness, medium high acidity, fruitiness, and a good body. So that's great. And then when they were asked additional questions, they were asked which of the blind samples tasted like Arabica. And so more judges thought that the Stenophylla coffee was Arabica than even the Arabica from Brazil, which was super interesting and promising. Then we look at the positive notes from the SCA evaluation. They said it's reminiscent of a washed African Arabica, close to a Rwandan profile, including sweetness, fruit-driven acidity, and gave a ton of positive notes like stone fruit, soft fruits, honey, black tea, jasmine, spice, floral, chocolate, list goes on. So all of that indicates that the quality is really promising and potentially, very close to Arabica. And then you look at some of the negative notes, kind of pulled into here. And so the SCA score that the panel leader gave the coffee was 80.25. And of course, there are variations in how people use the scoring sheet. But generally speaking, 80.25 is not a great score and a little bit confusing given all the positive notes about the coffee, right? And so when I'm cupping coffees, I want to make sure that my notes and my score match, right? If I'm saying all these really kind of flowery, lovely words about a coffee and trying to paint a lovely picture of a coffee, I want to make sure my score matches that or complements that. And so that's maybe the biggest question mark to me in this paper is why the 80.25 with all these lovely flavors. And since those the negative flavors they mentioned, they said that they weren't pronounced at all. So I wonder if it was the processing that brought that score down. And because everything else is sort of pointing toward it deserving potentially a higher score, but I don't know. I guess we'll never know. I think we can sort of gather that the coffee can be similar to Arabica, but I'm so curious, what these sensory results would have looked like with a larger sample size, more SCA scores and, maybe less crude processing. So I hope that can come soon.
Yeah, I think it's quite encouraging that they were able to cup that coffee to be specialty grade, given that it was basically processed by hand indoors very crudely, as you say. Also in the SI, so to get back to the stuff that's in there, they say that because they only had 10 grams of that coffee, they couldn't do a full 5 cups for the cupping. And because they lacked the 5 cups.
No kidding.
Because they lacked 5 cups as required by the SAA protocol, they couldn't give a detailed score. Instead, a consensus score was awarded by the panel leader after agreement by the other 2 judges. So that's why that's kind of like a little bit odd. I also had questions about the CIRAD protocol because I didn't even know there were other cupping protocols that existed. I thought it was SCA only. So
I have never heard of it.
So the CIRAD one, they grind the coffees, and then for each sample, 15 grams was added to basically a French press, to which 300 milliliters of boiling water were added. And then the hot water was poured directly onto the measured ground coffee. Shortly afterwards, once the coffee solids had risen to the surface, the mixture was stirred and then was left to stand for exactly 5 minutes, after which 60 mils was poured out into 5 cups. So it seems pretty standard, pretty similar to a normal cupping.
Sort of, except for this one, you're separating the grounds from the
and then you pour out
liquid and you're decanting.
Yep.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that should be said is that we do need to remember when this study was done. So this study was harvested in November of 2020. And they proceeded to then do the work over the space of early 2021 when the paper was submitted around that time.
Mhm.
And you have to recall what cupping was like. Carly, do you remember cupping in 2021?
I did it by myself.
You did, because you couldn't do it with other people. You couldn't share a cup the normal way that you would typically do because of COVID limitations. And so one possibility is that they had to do this
Mm,
because you could not have those people taste from those cups without, presenting some risk at the time. But there's something to be learned from this anyway. Like brewing, that's a pretty weird brew ratio. 300 milliliters of water to 15 grams of coffee is, I'd say, targeting deliberately thin. And I have no idea about the solubility of this coffee. I have no idea, when they say light, medium, and dark roast throughout the paper, I have really truly no idea what that means for a new variety of coffee that we've never seen before. So
mm,
it's quite hard. But let me say one thing about this. So in the supporting information, there's an Excel sheet that I encourage people to take a look at, because it lists the different coffee species as well as their quote unquote roast intensity, or in other words, the color of the coffee.
mm.
And for most coffees on this list, the perceived overall quality was highest when the coffee was roast darkest. Now that is interesting, because it's like, okay, so that's one thing that I think a lot of people who taste high quality Arabica would say does not map to what you would usually go for. Because if the quality is there, you start to lose certain flavor characteristics at some level of development. So we're presented with a crossroads here, because on one hand, it could very well be that what they call dark is actually not that dark, and that would explain that. On the other hand, it could be that that you pick a color and then you go around that color. So we don't really know. But one thing is for sure is that the Stenophylla seemed to have basically plateaued acidity. For the Arabica they looked at, the acidity seemed to be second highest when roasted light, the lowest when roasted medium, and the most acidic when roasted dark. And so that is a real eyebrow raiser, because it's like, okay, so it's not even a linear relationship. Okay, I'm taking you down the wrong path here,
Oh,
Carly.
it's interesting.
I know there's so much in this. Okay, so I've got two thoughts on this. The first thought is, it's funny that these people have written a paper about how this could be the variety that could, in principle, replace or substitute or supplement Arabica, and yet was only able to get 10 grams of it. So not, suboptimal in that sense. And the second thing that I thought was kind of interesting is that the paper is only half about actual sensory measurements, and then the other half was a check all that apply to a much larger audience. I mean, the sample size was much larger, and the questions they asked were fourfold. Does this taste like a new coffee? Could this coffee be commercialized? Does it taste like Robusta? Does it taste like Arabica?
Mhm.
And looking over the data here, 50% of people identified Stenophylla as tasting like a new coffee. All the other tasters said that the Robusta and the Arabica from Brazil and Ethiopia were familiar enough, which means this definitely does have a different flavor profile. So Carly, to go back to the thing you were saying about like, how did they actually taste this and like the differences in caffeine and all that, I would bet that this coffee tasted pretty freaky. I bet you like it hit the copying table and you were going around the table and you landed on that one. You're like, whoa.
I wonder in what way though, because that wasn't really captured in the tasting notes in the paper. They say they compare it to, and it's normal, right, to compare to Arabica, because I think they want it to taste like Arabica, and I think there are qualities that definitely signs that show that it does taste like Arabica in many ways. But what are the ways that it tastes new? I want to know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, all we've got to go by is this radar graph, and we just have to use our imagination. And I'm sure that
Well, we have the radar graph in James Hoffman. He said it tasted a lot, like very strongly of peach. And it
Wow.
must be sufficiently strongly of peach to make it seem like something that is new, but still in the Arabica world and something that you could use the SCA flavor wheel for.
but here's the next question was, could you commercialize it? And two things jump out at me. First of all, 100% of people said you could commercialize the Arabica from Ethiopia. 80% of people said you could commercialize the Robusta from Indonesia and Stenophylla, the exotic species we're talking about. And then only 73% of people said you could commercialize the Arabica from Brazil.
This wasn't a great paper for Brazil Arabica, was it?
Can you imagine going around the table and tasting that and be like, no, that
No one's gonna want that.
The next two questions were, does it taste Robusta-like? Does it taste Arabica-like? 93% of people said that the Robusta from Indonesia tasted Robusta-like. So that's good. And 2% of people said Stenophylla tasted like Robusta. So that is also good, because that's basically saying that it is not driven by that characteristic Robusta sensory profile that we're used to. Then the Arabica question, does the Robusta sample taste like Arabica? No, 7% of people said it did. So no, it does not. Stenophylla was 81% of people said it tasted like Arabica. The Ethiopian sample, 98% of people said that tasted like Arabica. But I don't want to keep dunking on Brazil here, but the Arabica from Brazil, only 44% of people said that coffee tasted like Arabica. So I guess what we take from this is that what the panel was looking for were acid and fruit forward flavors. This Brazilian coffee, I'm sure, was solid. I'm sure it was a good Brazilian coffee that is used almost like all over the world in almost all blends, and it's solid. And the Stenophylla seems to be closer to that of something that the specialty community might actually engage with.
Yeah, I think this part of the entire paper was maybe, the most clear to me in how promising this might be. It just having, compared it to another Arabica coffee, and obviously, we know potential of Brazilian coffee on the market, so can only imagine. Still very curious what makes this a new coffee from a sensory perspective, but I really appreciated that they asked these questions, and I think they're really revealing.
Science is doing its very best to understand and sort of push the boundaries of knowledge, but not necessarily trying to take away money from the producer or necessarily even make money for the consumer. It's not really about that. And I think this paper actually did a wonderful job of showing that. This was a treasure hunt paper. This was them saying, there is this enigmatic species that people have heard about. Very few people have tasted. Let's go do the experiment and say, is it really worth tasting? Once we know that, now we can make good decisions based on whether it's actually worth planting, whether it's encumbering the costs to do so, and whether we're going to find ways to champion the producers and learn how to extract from this in an efficient way so that we can continue to have tasty coffee for the future. So that in mind, I think that's really the point of this paper. And hopefully we did a good job of going through it. I mean, there's always plays left on the field, but Carly, I don't think you left a play on the field. You did a great job.
Can I tell you a story really quick, Chris, that I've wanted to tell you for 7 years?
Blimey. That was a professional transition.
Sorry, that was like quite a way to introduce a new topic.
I like that. I like it. Go for it.
Okay. So in 2017, I went to your Rico talk on the benefits of freezing coffee. And I was on like year 2 of my career in green coffee sourcing and quality control. I was still so fresh. And I was so skeptical of your talk. I'm like crossing my arms, like, that's not going to work. Like, freezing coffee, who's this guy, And I left the room and I went to the main area where George Howell was serving his coffees that had been frozen in green for 4 years or whatever. And they were so incredible and age-free that something happened in my brain in that moment. And I realized I knew absolutely nothing. Like, have you heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where it's like the thing where you overestimate how much you know when you first start to learn about something? And then, so watching your talk, I was in the first stage of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where they call like Mount Stupid, where you think you know everything, right? And I was on like the tippy top of Mount Stupid. And then the moment I tasted that coffee, I entered the next phase, which is known as the Valley of Despair. And so I realized I just knew absolutely nothing. So I just want to thank you personally for kicking me off of Mount Stupid and bringing me to the Valley of Despair.
I feel like a lot of my graduate students would say that I'm extremely good at taking people to the Valley of Despair. This coffee that George Howell had kept frozen green was truly a special coffee when it was fresh. I myself was skeptical about whether that coffee would have survived being frozen for n number of years. My goodness, that was by far the best coffee that we had at the Rico Symposium. Like, there's a ton of good coffee there. That was by far the best. This was well, it speaks to him as being an excellent green buyer and finding excellent coffees, number one. But honestly, you know, as a scientist, you do these experiments, you don't really know that it's going to work. You know, it just should work, but someone's got to actually do it. And for me, I found myself in the equivalent of the Valley of Despair. I was on Mount Stupid for a while, but then I was like in the opposite of despair. I was very, very happy because it was like finally the experiment that I'd thought of for years, I got to actually taste. Those that are interested in hearing more about Cherry Love, Carly's endeavors in the coffee industry, and all things related to this new and exciting way of engaging with roasted coffee should check out your social media. What's your handle?
The Cherry Love handle is Cherry Love Coffee, one
Nice.
word. And I've also got my other Instagram account, Coffee with Carly.
Yeah, so Coffee with Carly, I've been following for some time. And I will say, what's the word, Doran? Is it
Anthropomorphic.
okay? So your anthropomorphic videos that you have uploaded make me laugh deeply.
Oh, thank you. Gosh, I mean, if you ever want to take one of your very established coffee research papers and turn it into a trash reality television skit, like, I really hope you'll call me.
Hey, well, you will definitely get a phone call. I've got plenty of scientific papers that I would like to see acted out in your way. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that was super fun.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. I really, really appreciate you bringing me in on this.